Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Today, a committee of advisors to the CDC is meeting to discuss how vaccines should be used in America. Now, typically this meeting doesn't make a lot of news, except this time, many people will be paying attention. That's because Secretary Kennedy fired every single member of the last committee, replacing them with his handpicked choices. Why did he fire them? He says it's because it was time for a clean sweep to restore trust in vaccine science, that the old committee was a rubber stamp for Big Pharma, hiding its conflicts of interest. Basically, he said, we couldn't trust the old crew of independent experts. So does that mean we can trust the new crew? Today, we want to dive into what's happening, why we're even talking about a committee of vaccine experts, and how this might impact every one of us. We're joined by two of the fired committee members to hear directly from them about all of this. And later, physician and scientist Dr. Michael Mina, who has been outspoken about these recent moves, helps us understand what on earth is going on. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome, everybody.
It is so nice to have everyone here. We have a feast of a show for you today, y'all. Lots of great interviews. But first, let's tell you who we are and what we're all about. I'm Brenda Adhikari.
I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Dr. Maggie Bartlett.
I'm Dr. Mark Abdulmalik.
Yeah, Maggie is a virologist at Johns Hopkins. Mark is a physician and a medical reporter. Brenda and I are journalists. And this is the Why Should I Trust You podcast. It's all about our breakdown in trust in public health, science, medicine, and what we might want to do about it. And it's also seems to be the place where you come when you've been pushed out of your job at HHS by the new team.
Yeah. It's kind of become like, hey, if you mistrust government or you've been recently fired by government, come, like, pull up a chair, pull up a bar stool. We'll pour you a proverbial pint and come join us, talk to us. Look, we have a bunch of super interesting guests today. Like we said a little later in the program. Who says program? A little later in the I know. I'm like, a little later in the program. A little later in the show, we're going to welcome Dr. Michael Mina. He is a well-known immunologist and scientist. He's going to help us understand what we should and should not be freaking out about this moment. It's always nice to have a reality check. But first, we are thrilled to welcome Charlotte Moser and Dr. Jamie Lair. Jamie and Charlotte, up until about 2 weeks ago, they served on the committee we're going to talk to you about today, the one that makes recommendations for how millions of Americans should be vaccinated, like basically like what groups and when, and then they were fired. Guys, we're really happy to welcome you here. Hi, Charlotte and Dr. Lair.
Thank you for having us.
Great.
What we're really looking for is help to understand what this committee is, what it's not, how you see this moment, and of course, how you guys are doing. It's been kind of a rough couple of weeks, I imagine. So just hang in there for a bit as we take a stab at trying to help our listeners just kind of get a lay of the land, some of the basics of your old committee, and what Secretary Kennedy said his rationale was for firing you guys. And we should also mention that we're recording this podcast on Tuesday. It drops on Thursdays, as you know. Anything could happen between now and then. So, hopefully we're giving you a kind of a big picture view about all this stuff. Okay. So Tom, take it away. How did we get here?
Yeah, I think it's probably helpful to start back in February. That's when RFK and he had his confirmation hearings to head up the Department of HHS. And if you can remember, it wasn't exactly clear that he was going to have the votes to get out a committee before even, going in front of the full Senate. And that meant all eyes were on one pivotal vote. And that was Republican Senator Bill Cassidy. So Cassidy is a doctor and a staunch vaccine supporter. And Cassidy pressed Kennedy to prove that he wouldn't undermine America's vaccines policies. And Kennedy promised that he wouldn't. Still, Cassidy was on the fence, or at least appeared to be. And everything kind of hung in the balance. And then Cassidy took the floor of the Senate and announced he was going to vote yes, which meant basically RFK was going to be confirmed. And in that moment, Cassidy gave a speech and he tried to reassure the public. He revealed that Kennedy and him had a conversation, and Kennedy had promised to work within the vaccine safety and monitoring systems of the country. And critically, Cassidy said Kennedy had promised him that he'd, quote, maintain the CDC's advisory committee on immunization practices without changes. Then on June 9th, 117 days on the job, Secretary Kennedy fired all 17 members of that very committee. So if he had made a promise to Senator Cassidy, it appears that he broke it.
Let's take a step back and go over what exactly this committee is. It stands for the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. Some people call it ACIP, some people say ACIP. Bottom line, it's a federal advisory committee. And these are individuals who've been selected for their various expertise. Think about it. Virologists, immunologists, pediatricians, internal medicine, public health, family medicine. You get the point. Basically, people who are very familiar with public health and medicine. And they have a unique set of expertise. They provide advice and guidance to the director of the CDC. And they do this to figure out the best way to prevent vaccine preventable diseases in the United States. So there's a whole process of how you get a vaccine onto market. And ACIP is just one of those steps along the way. So once a vaccine is approved by the FDA, then ACIP takes it up. Usually they meet a few times a year. These are big public meetings. Anybody who wants to pay attention and tune in can. Probably not that many people do. They've crunched all kinds of data, and they're there to debate and eventually vote, put some money on it and vote. They do all the heavy lifting. They study the disease states, the pharmacology, the vaccines, the safety that's been already granted by the FDA. And they look at costs, and they do this so the rest of us, doctors and public health leaders, can hear, clear, and act on trusted guidance to keep people healthy and protected. So they make the recommendations to the CDC, and then the CDC then makes recommendations for the public. So before Kennedy fired everyone, there were 17 voting members of the committee. And a simple majority is what it takes for the committee to formally make a recommendation. And then the head of the CDC either accepts or rejects it.
Yeah, Mark, I just want to underscore one thing that you said that I think is really important. This committee recommends when a vaccine is given, and that means they're critical for devising America's immunization schedule, which vaccines are recommended for kids and when they are recommended to get them. ACIP's recommendations, once adopted by the head of the CDC, sets our standards for pediatricians, insurers, school districts. States take these recommendations and then set up what is required for the vaccines in the schedule to get done before kindergarten when they enroll in public school. The vaccine schedule is just one of the really big things that the mistrustful of vaccines point to with real fear and concern, basically the number of vaccines. And so this is something the committee thinks about a lot. And finally, these recommendations determine which ones are made available for free for kids under the Vaccines for Children program, which provides vaccines to about half of all America's children. Again, for free, which I think is critically important to consider when we're thinking about immunization across the country, because that's something that we have here in the US that isn't universal.
Yeah.
Let's go through some of Secretary Kennedy's criticism of ACIP and his justifications for firing them and announcing an entirely new slate of members. So 2 weeks ago, like we mentioned, Secretary Kennedy wrote in a Wall Street Journal piece. He begins by writing, a headline that you can't miss. The U.S. faces a crisis of public trust. I mean, look, our whole podcast is called Why Should I Trust You? So he says we have a history of, quote, skewed science that has plagued the vaccine regulatory apparatus for decades. And then he basically says a clean sweep was needed to reestablish public confidence in vaccine science. So we're going to go through some of these, especially since we have two of the members here. But we're going to go through some of these accusations that Secretary Kennedy leveled at your committee and get your response in a moment. But first, let's just put them on the table. So what's going on? First, he says the ACIP committee has been plagued by conflicts of interest and that you just were a rubber stamp for Big Pharma's vaccines. That's one thing. Then he says ACIP has never recommended against a vaccine, and that includes vaccines that later were pulled because of safety issues. And he also says things like the committee has failed to scrutinize vaccine products given to babies and pregnant women, which is a whole charge of the committee. And finally, he describes ACIP as meeting behind closed doors where they are so non-transparent, they are violating the legal and ethical principles. So there's a lot there in terms of the allegations against the old committee.
Yeah. And then the secretary quickly named 8 new committee members. And we are taping this ahead of time, but this brand new committee is supposed to meet this week. Secretary Kennedy told ABC News that the new ACIP members would not be anti-vaxxers, but rather credentialed scientists and doctors who follow objective and evidence-based medicine. He wrote that the new team, quote, won't directly work for the vaccine industry. And we'll discuss later in the program who these new members are and their track records on vaccines, and what we know about what they're meeting this week.
All right, so let's go ahead and bring in Charlotte Moser and Jamie Lair, now former ACIP members. We really appreciate you both coming on.
Thanks for having us.
First, how did you find out that you were fired? Jamie, why don't we start with you?
So the ACIP members have a text group,
And we started noticing that the Wall Street Journal editorial had come out around 4 or 4:30 on that Monday. And we shared that among ourselves. And then it became official around 6 p.m. that day when we got a 2-line sentence email from the HHS saying that we were no longer members.
So you didn't find out until you saw it in the Wall Street Journal, Charlotte?
Right. It was
wild.
public information before we found out.
Yeah.
How long had you guys been on the committee?
I had only been on the committee about a year, following about a 2-year process to get on the committee. Jamie had been on longer.
So I've been on the ACIP voting committee for 4 years, but I've been on the work groups all the way since 2010.
Jamie, what went through your mind when you saw that journal article?
I was very disappointed. I've enjoyed my work on the ACIP. It is volunteer work. We are there to try to set guidelines for practicing physicians, public health around the country. And we're there to try to make vaccines useful and helpful. And we've done good work. And so I was very disappointed that all 17 people were removed, as was the secretariat. She was moved to a different position. So there's a huge loss of institutional memory that will be a problem going forward. And then I was just personally sad because I've enjoyed this work. And so I was sad for myself as well.
And Jamie, just remind us, what did you do exactly on the committee? So
I'm one of the voting members. I was going to be chair starting July 1st, so I'm no longer going to be chair.
Wow.
And the committee, people sort of wonder what ACIP does, and I'll just sort of put it into 3 terms. The first thing you need to know is that vaccines work. If you get vaccines, you're much less likely to get the disease. And then vaccines are safe. And so what the committee does is you take the vaccine that works and are safe, and we make recommendations for the American public about how to use them. And for 60 years, this process has worked really, really well. We've gotten rid of polio. We've gotten rid of Haemophilus influenza type B, which has been a deadly disease in the 1980s. It's been a very effective process. And the firing of it and the secretariat being moved has just devastated this process moving forward.
When people hear ACIP, I think there's some power misattributed to us. So like Jamie said, the vaccines are already proven to be safe and effective. They work and they're safe. That's work that's done by the FDA. So the vaccine is licensed by the FDA. And then the ACIP has an obligation to review not only the data related to the safety and efficacy, but also, who is this disease affecting? Who's getting sick and hospitalized from it? What do we know about the trends related to those things, as well as any side effects and safety, and then make recommendations as to who should use the vaccine, how, and when. And then there's the third component, that's the laws, vaccine requirements. And so sometimes ACIP gets blamed for vaccine laws, which we have nothing to do with. That's done at the state level. Or we get blamed because the vaccine is available, which we didn't have anything to do with either. That was the FDA. So we're kind of this middle piece. Once the vaccine is going to be available, we help people figure out how to use it. And then whether or not it's mandatory for subgroups is a state level decision.
I mean, I think we alluded to this earlier in this episode that a lot of Americans had never heard of you guys. This was not front of mind. The system just sort of worked in the background. And then suddenly you were pulled into the foreground. I think for a lot of people, they have only read the very high profile criticisms from Secretary Kennedy of you and the work that you were doing. So I think, it'd be a service here for you guys to have a chance to respond. So let's just walk through a couple of these, and you can take these any way you want. He said you guys on the committee were a rubber stamp for Big Pharma's vaccines, sort of in the pocket for Big Pharma. Jamie, when you imagine in your mind those committee meetings and who was sitting around those tables, were you guys in the pocket of Big Pharma?
No, not at all. So what we're doing is reviewing the data and saying, what's the best use of this? And there are clearly times when we went against what the pharmaceutical company wanted. So recently, the RSV vaccine for adults was recommended, and the FDA has actually approved it all the way down to age 50. And the CDC ACIP committee said, no, we've got some concerns about side effects. And so we're going to recommend it for people over 75. And then we're also going to recommend it for people 60 to 75 who've got risk factors. But we're not going to give you the full recommendation that the FDA did. We don't think that that's the right thing to do. We want more data before we expand the recommendation. And there are times when
And that's really the chance where you hear directly from the pharmaceutical industry. There's no other contacts that you're having with pharmaceutical industries. There's no private offlining with them to get more information, or they can make a case to you personally.
So there's no private offlining. There is no case personally. However, there is work that's done in the work groups, and that work is confidential. So the pharmaceutical companies will give us unpublished data or data that hasn't been reviewed yet, and it's going to the FDA, so it hasn't been officially approved the vaccine. And we do that for about a year in advance of the expected FDA approval. But that information is confidential. So when Secretary Kennedy says that things are confidential, part of the process is confidential and we can't explain it. But the actual decision making and the voting is very transparent. And all conflicts of interest are revealed at the beginning of every meeting and in advance of every vote. So I could perceive this as a very transparent process.
Hey, Jamie, let me just jump in and ask, which is the part that's confidential and you can't talk about? Like, why is that?
So those are called work group meetings. And so there are a number of work groups. I happen to be was chair of several of them: influenza, pneumococcal, meningitis. And so when a new vaccine is going to be approved by the FDA, they tell the FDA, we want this approval, and that takes about a year. And they tell the ACIP, we're looking for approval. And so you're going to have to make a decision on this vaccine when it comes out in a year. And so they start sharing with us the same information they share with the FDA. And the FDA can't share it either. It's confidential when the FDA has it. And until the approval process is finished, all that information is confidential and can't be expressed outside of our work groups or outside of the FDA. Once it has been approved by the FDA will then publish the data on which they're making their recommendation.
Is it possible that you're so ingrained in that process? And like Secretary Kennedy said in the Wall Street Journal article, it's not that you're corrupt. You just have blinders on and you're just doing what you think is the best, but you're immersed in a system, he says, of industry aligned incentives and paradigms that enforce a narrow pro-industry orthodoxy. Like you only have this one way of thinking. Is that a fair criticism?
It's a fair criticism to believe that we're pro-vaccine. I think everyone on the committee believes that vaccines are a good public health resource. And so I think that's a very fair criticism. And so we think that if the evidence shows that a vaccine is helpful, we're going to be in favor of it. That's not pro-industry. Someone has to make those vaccines, but that's pro-vaccine, and I'm very comfortable saying that.
Are you able to catch like a safety issue even with your pro-vaccine stance? Like, would you be?
Lord, yes, absolutely. We found Guillain-Barré in RSV. We found that the LAIV vaccine in 2011 wasn't as good as we thought it was. It wasn't a safety vaccine, but it was an efficacy thing. We found rotavirus in 1999. So we have found vaccines and we've changed our mind.
You found problems in vaccines. Just
problems with vaccines. Thank you. We found problems with vaccines and we've changed our minds and changed the recommendations. And we've also found that times when we actually don't need as many vaccines as we thought, and we'll say, oh, we thought you needed 3 boosters, but you really only need 2. So I think that shows the flexibility that when new data comes along, we're willing to change our minds.
But are you too slow to do that? Or like how confident are you in the pace of that? And are people harmed while you take your time to figure that out?
I think you're never going to have all of the answers when a new vaccine comes along. So you have to make decisions based on what you know at the time, and then you need to carefully monitor what's happening. And there are a slew of different safety mechanisms in place in the United States to do that. So it's not like a vaccine recommendation is made and then everybody just goes and looks at another vaccine and forgets about that. There is constant monitoring of that. And the other thing that I think people might not think about is that these infectious diseases, the pathogens that cause these infectious diseases, are going to change over time too. So if we're doing really good vaccinating against chickenpox, as an example, then there's less of an opportunity for chickenpox to be, for people to be exposed to chickenpox in the environment. So that means that maybe over time we need another dose, or maybe over time it's like polio or smallpox or measles even, where we have eliminated it, enough people are vaccinated so we don't need to be worrying about getting those vaccines, or decreasing the number of doses, or changing the recommendations for different groups. That's something that this committee over the last 6 decades has been monitoring and doing. And the other thing I would say is that these recommendations, our families have to take them too. So we're not going to be so involved in the process that we're going to forget what we're doing and just rubber stamp something that's not safe. I mean, we want to protect our families and our friends as much as we want to protect the people of this country.
Yeah, Charlotte, I think you were getting sort of the heart of the matter, which is when you said, we're approving these things for our own families. We talk a lot on this podcast about the breakdown in trust. And there's a lot of people in the public who feel that a committee like yours, a committee they'd never heard of, but now that it's on top of mind, that you don't have their best interests at heart, that they can't trust you, that you are conflicted, that you have conflicts of interest that you are hiding. This message really resonates with them. And it really gets, like I said, to the heart of this matter. I think, Jamie, could you talk about the steps that the committee took to reveal any possible conflicts of interest? Like, literally, what did you guys do to put this out there in the public space? Was it before you joined? Was it while you joined? Before you took up a specific vaccine? Like, how did this go down?
So there's specific forms that we have to go through, and that form goes down a very common list of possible conflicts of interest. So that conflict of interest might involve work that you've done. It might involve work that someone in your family's done. Do they work for a pharmaceutical company? It might involve stocks. It might involve that you are a speaker for a pharmaceutical company. It might involve that you were part of a research study. And so we have to declare all of those. And then if any of those are potentially conflicted with a certain vaccine, we have to recuse ourselves from voting about that vaccine. The ACIP says that if the expert skills are so required that the ACIP wants that person on for all the vaccines, they will give a temporary waiver, and we have to recuse ourselves from a certain vaccine. But for me, I'm a family doctor in a small practice in Ithaca, and I had to sell some stock because I had some stock in a pharmaceutical company before I could join the ACIP. But that was it. I sold the stock and that was easy. So I just find it sort of, there's not really a conflict of interest. All the people there have taken care of them before they can even join the ACIP.
And on top of that, every single year we need to fill out that paperwork again. And like Jamie said, before at the beginning of every meeting, we have to declare any conflicts. And even in the work groups, any conflicts have to be declared, not just by the voting members, but by anybody on that call who has a conflict. And then also at the beginning of before every vote, we have to declare any potential conflicts. So it's not something that's done once at the beginning of the process and then it goes away. It's something that's a consistent theme throughout the entire time you're working on this committee, even down to the fact that your kids can't have stocks in these pharmaceutical companies that make vaccines, or that's considered a conflict. So it's an impressive process that works to make sure that this is all transparent and people know where we're coming from. But on the other side to that, as Jamie said, you don't want people who don't know these processes, that don't understand the science or know what questions to ask to make sure that every stone is being overturned when we're looking at potentially recommending a vaccine for different groups of people throughout the country.
Let me ask both of you, what about the notion that, with a new regime change, they should get a chance to put people in that maybe they're trying to try some, like a new way of looking at things out? What's wrong with putting in some new people? Jamie, why don't you take that?
So elections have consequences. And so I understand that perspective. And you could say, as Mark was commenting, that maybe we are too pro-vaccine and you need some more skeptics in there. And so that is a reasonable thought process. And I, as my wife says, am very naive. And I was hoping that Secretary Kennedy would put in some people who are very grounded in science and had vast vaccine experience, but were maybe more skeptical than I to bring a different perspective. But as long as they were evidence-based and looking at the data and willing to change their minds on the data, I would have been happy. Now, I would have been sad personally, but I would have been happy because the process would have been respected and the process would have gone forward. What I am opposed to is having all 17 members removed at once, because that destroys the process. We had a rotation that was very important because you learn as you go along how the system works. In addition, there's institutional memory. You've also lost the leader of the secretariat. And so I find that the process has been disrupted. In addition to, I have questions about the new people who have been chosen and whether they have experience or whether they really have open minds. So that's my major objection. Not that he doesn't have the right to do it, but I think he did it in a way that wasn't healthy for the ACIP or for the public health of the country.
So you've been on the committee, you said, for 10 years as a working group member and then for 4 years as a voting member. So you've got about 14 years, is that right, of experience on this committee?
About that, yes.
Okay. So all those years, could you identify a couple of things that you didn't like about the committee? Are there changes that you had advocated for that you hadn't seen yet? Like, nothing is a perfect committee, obviously. What didn't you like about it?
What I didn't like about it personally is that I think that the cost effectiveness evaluation was too in favor of the vaccines. So I personally think that the pharmaceutical companies know how much the cost effectiveness analysis is going to be willing to pay, and they price their vaccines at a certain price. And some of the vaccines I think were very, very expensive. And so that's a cost issue. I also think that some of the conversations could have been broader, that there were too many presentations and less actual discussion among the ACIP members. I think the discussion was the most valuable part of the meetings because that's where little tips that might have got missed in the discussion get fleshed out. And so if I was chair, I was going to actually say we need shorter presentations and longer discussions.
Wait, tell me about cost. So are you saying that the vaccines were too expensive and you were approving vaccines that were too expensive? What do you mean by that?
Okay. So what happens is when you're giving a vaccine and you're giving something like polio, you're saving thousands of lives and preventing thousands of diseases for a certain amount of money. And that actually saves society money. And that is wonderful. And some of the older vaccines are very, very cost effective. You're saving money. But some of the newer vaccines are for rarer diseases, and they're expensive vaccines. And so if you literally only have 1 in a million people getting a disease, are you going to vaccinate 1 million teenagers to prevent 1 case of meningitis? And that's the kind of thing that I feel that the ACIP wasn't looking at carefully enough. And to be fair, Charlotte and I have had honest discussions pro and against this. And she says that she goes against me on this. But there are perspectives on the ACIP which say that maybe we shouldn't be approving all these vaccines for a variety of reasons, for safety reasons, but also for cost reasons. Did I answer your question?
Yes, you did.
Yes. So I wanted to ask both of your perspectives on how the committee has looked at thimerosal in vaccines, and the thoughts on that being a new topic for this new group.
Charlotte, do you want to take that?
Sure. So thimerosal in vaccines is not a new topic. That was visited in the early 2000s, and really thimerosal was removed from vaccines by the early 2000s, by 2001. It was never shown to cause harm in the levels that it was available in vaccines for children, but it was taken out proactively because of concerns around the increasing number of vaccines and could it cause harm. And again, many studies have shown that it hasn't caused harm, but unfortunately that the new administration continues to be concerned about related to vaccine ingredients. And so it seemed like it was surprising to see that come back up on the agenda for this week, because for the routinely recommended childhood vaccines, the only vaccine that could even contain thimerosal at this point is if a child gets a dose of influenza vaccine from a multi-dose vial. So what thimerosal is it's a preservative, so that if you have a multi-dose vial vaccine and you stick a needle in that vaccine, in that vial multiple times to get different doses out, you could inadvertently have something on the needle that goes into the vial and it could grow something. And before thimerosal was in vaccines, that would happen. So if you're the first child to get a vaccine out of a multi-dose vial, then you're good. But the second child could inadvertently be exposed to bacteria that were introduced when the needle went through the rubber stopper to get that first dose out. And in those cases, a child who got a vaccine in that way and there was no preservative in the vial, they could get an abscess because there were bacteria that were in the vial. And so thimerosal was put into vaccines to prevent that from happening. Eventually, because of the concerns around thimerosal, a lot of the companies switched to single-dose vials. And so they don't need a preservative because each child gets their own dose of vaccine, if you will. And so thimerosal has been removed from the routinely recommended childhood vaccines. It's a shame if we're going to go back to talking about things where the science has been asked and answered, because I think then we potentially overlook other issues. And we also confuse the public and scare the public about things that really are non-issues.
Right. So just so it's clear for our listeners, there is a public agenda for the meeting. And on that agenda is the topic of thimerosal, which has been a hot topic for years, decades, among communities that do not trust vaccines and believe the vaccines cause various problems for children, such as autism. But just to be clear, there's nothing new in the science. There's been nothing that's been publicized recently that would demand or even inspire that this topic would be put on an agenda right now.
Correct. There's no thimerosal in any of the routinely recommended childhood vaccines. There's only some.
And there's no new information. There's nothing
no new information.
Is it possible that taking the thimerosal out has backfired? Right. There was nothing to suggest that it caused a problem to begin with. Yet it seems like all these public health experts and scientists said, well, let's just take it out. Do you see how that could actually backfire and create more mistrust?
So that was actually one of the arguments from the early 2000s. Wow. And so when this was done, the science wasn't as settled as it is now. And we have clear evidence that methylmercury is damaging. And so there was a question about whether ethylmercury might be damaging. And there wasn't any data along those lines. But the people said, let's just take it out of an abundance of caution. And if they had been right, they would have been hailed as leaders and far-seeing. But because further data show that thimerosal has no damaging effect at all, they took it out. But they said, well, maybe this is a problem. And they set themselves up for a question of, well, maybe vaccines aren't safe. And there are a lot of people who feel that was one of the original sins in favor of vaccine hesitancy. Now, having said that, there are other problems at that time. And I would also say that in my experience, and I have a very large vaccine hesitant population, when one thing is proven to no longer be suspicious, they do tend to latch onto other things. And so I think vaccine hesitant people are vaccine hesitant and they might take anything that they can find as something to latch onto. And thimerosal was the issue in the early 2000s.
I think that's really interesting, Jamie, because, we also speak to a lot of folks on the show who are vaccine hesitant. Now, I'll just say, and I wonder if you experience this in your communities, there are folks who do end up taking the vaccine once they have good conversations where they feel like their answer. So I do maybe want to push back a little bit on the idea that they will always find something. I think there probably is a population like that, but amongst the folks we talk to, there are folks who are just looking for their questions to be answered. And on that note, I just say there's a couple of folks we told amongst some of the more skeptical folks, not necessarily vaccine skeptical, but just have questions. And I just wanted to just ask a couple of those from a few MAHA folks. One is, is there something you would have been willing to do under Secretary Kennedy's leadership had you not been terminated from ACIP? What would that have been like for you, Charlotte?
I mean, I was willing to serve on the committee, and I think that we really need to look at the science and follow the science. It doesn't really matter who's the Secretary of Health and Human Services. We need to look at the data no matter who's sitting at that table. And so I think I was hoping to still be on the committee, even though Secretary Kennedy, was in place. So that didn't really matter to me who was there, as long as we're seeing accurate data and then we're being able to discuss it and we're able to make, informed decisions based on that. I also think to your point, Brenda, I too hesitate to use the word vaccine hesitancy to talk about a lot of people, because I think there's a small group of people who don't want to accept vaccines and probably will never change their mind. But there's a lot of people who feel like they need to quote unquote do their own research related to vaccines, and that means they have questions, and they just need those questions answered. So to me, that's not someone who's vaccine hesitant. It's just someone who has questions about vaccines. But I do think that when you're talking about some of the folks like Jamie was mentioning, if you're looking for something to inform an already formed opinion, it's all going to seem like it's evidence toward that end. So if you already feel like this group of decision makers was corrupt, then you're going to, everything that happens, you're going to be looking at it through that lens. So I just think we all have to come towards the middle and talk to one another. And it's why I love the sessions you all have been doing with the MAHA group and the public health officials, because when you listen to people on those calls, there are threads of commonality amongst the groups. And I think as a people, that's who we are. We all would rather build something than tear something down.
Yeah, Jamie, did you want to jump in?
I want to say one thing is, in my private practice, I have probably 25% of my people who do not vaccinate on the regular schedule. And that's a very large proportion compared to the national average, which is about 7%. And I have about 8 to 10% who don't vaccinate at all. So I am not disparaging them at all. I listen to them, I talk to them, I try to persuade them, and they're very used to me always hearing, I'm going to offer vaccines. You can politely decline, but I feel that you need to hear why I believe in vaccines. And so I respect them. I just disagree with them. And so I hear where people are coming from, and I don't want to feel like I'm opposed to people who are hesitant about vaccines, but I disagree with them.
Yeah. No, I do hear that. What I'm hearing you both say is that there's obviously hardened, dug-in people on all kinds of issues in this country, and that no matter what you say, you're probably not going to move them. But I think what I'm also hearing you say is that there's groups of people who are just seeking more information or seeking the ability to make their own decisions. And we are also hearing from those groups. And I'm also just curious, in that 8 to 10% or whatever, if the way you present information could actually move somebody one way or the other. And it's always a puzzle. It's always something. There is one other question, Jamie, that I wanted to pose to you, because this has come up many times. Can you see the benefit of safety testing vaccines against inert placebos to regain trust, even if you don't believe it's necessary to prove a vaccine is safe? That's a question we get a lot about inert placebos. And maybe you can even help us explain what all that means.
So in the perfect world, and this is what we did with the mRNA COVID vaccines, you gave the vaccine to half the people and you gave a very inert placebo to half the people. And you could tell very easily whether the vaccine was causing any problems and whether the vaccine was protecting. So it was a classic double-blind randomized controlled trial. It was a beautiful trial. However, there are times when that is not the best method of studying vaccines. So the easy one is, let's say you already have a measles vaccine and you want to try a new measles vaccine. Well, it's unethical to give someone a placebo because then they're not getting protected against measles. So what you simply do is you compare the new measles vaccine to the old measles vaccine. And so that's what we consider the most ethical trial. And so you could say that's not a randomized controlled placebo trial, but it's an ethical trial and it's still randomized and it's still blinded, but it's not placebo. And another one that they'll talk about is, well, this placebo isn't perfectly inert. Well, some of the vaccines have a reaction that's sort of built into them by what's called an adjuvant. And when you have an adjuvant, you're going to get a reaction. And you might get a sore arm or you might get something. And that actually makes the vaccine work better. Well, then if you're giving that child with the vaccine and the adjuvant and you can see that they're having a reaction and you give the other child just sugar water, then you might be able to easily tell which child got the vaccine and which child didn't. And it's no longer a blinded trial. And so then you're sort of saying, is it worth having a totally inert placebo, or is it better to have the adjuvant in the placebo so that you won't be blinded to who's getting the reaction? Having said all that, if it would convince people to actually have a perfectly randomized controlled trial with an inert placebo, then yes, if that's going to be convincing to people, then maybe that's the best way to go. I think that's more than is necessary. But again, different people have different perspectives.
Yes.
And I'm going to beg to differ there because I think that it's unethical and it's also a waste of limited resources. Jamie made a good case for why we can't always use an inert placebo. And if we were going to test a new measles vaccine and use it against an inert placebo, that would be unethical, especially knowing that right now there are measles outbreaks occurring across this country. So we would be leaving kids at risk. And sometimes families will say, well, let us choose. There's a bunch of us who would like to be in the unvaccinated group, but that doesn't allow us to set up the appropriate trial because somebody who chooses to be in the unvaccinated group is likely different than somebody who chooses to be in the vaccinated group. They may have different healthcare seeking behaviors. They may have different things they do to ensure their health at home. That sets up a difference other than just the vaccine. So you really need to randomize who's in which group. You can't let people self-select. And so in a setting like this, we can't, even if people say they would be convinced by a placebo-controlled trial with an inert placebo, it would be unethical and it would be a use of resources in a time when we're saying that we are trying to conserve resources. We have to do what's best for the people that are going to be using these vaccines. So yeah. I guess Jamie and I will be a little bit different on that one too.
First of all, you guys disagreed on the placebo trials. Did you guys have those frank and honest discussions on the committee? I mean, did you guys get boxing gloves out? Like, what did you guys do when you disagreed? Can you help people understand that this committee wasn't groupthink, or was it groupthink?
Wasn't groupthink. Jamie and I were both on the meningococcal working group together, and we can tell you we were on different sides of a lot of conversations. And it's always done respectfully, but it's still a matter of this is your opportunity to bring forward your way of thinking. And there are, like I said, there could be up to 30 people on the phone. If all those people don't have the same approach to these questions or the same interpretation of these data. And so those conversations are so instructive and really help us as a country get to the best place when it comes to these vaccine decisions.
Jamie, what is keeping you up at night right now?
What's keeping me up at night is that the providers, physicians, nurse practitioners, public health people in the country will no longer trust the ACIP. and they're going to make recommendations that are not evidence-based, and they're going to make recommendations that are harmful to the public health. But if that's the case, then I think we're going to have people from around the country, organizations and states, making up their own rules. So, for example, Wisconsin has already said that they believe that pregnant people should be getting the COVID vaccine. And so they've made a law that has to happen. And that's going against what the ACIP has changed recently. And if you have all these different guidelines around the country, then the public health is going to be different in different places in the country, depending on what state you're in or all sorts of things. And so that worries me, and I worry for the public health.
So as you look ahead to this new committee stepping in, and I know we've talked about them, what advice would you offer them for building and rebuilding public trust that maybe was lost on your watch, they say, especially at a time when confidence in these institutions is so fragile?
From my point of view, I hope they follow the science, and I hope that a lot of the systems that were already in place continue to be in place, continue to be funded. We've seen some suggestions that people are leaving the CDC because they're concerned that their data are going to be misrepresented. And that's really worrisome to me, because if we don't have good data to follow, or these surveillance systems are no longer available, it's going to be really difficult for any committee to make good recommendations for the public. You know, what's keeping me up right now is what's not going to happen, more what's going to happen. And what I mean by that is that depending on the decisions that are made, vaccines may become less available. And I think regardless of what happens, there's going to be a lot more confusion, and that confusion is going to further erode this already fragile trust that we're all talking about. And the end result is going to be that families are going to say, I don't know what to do. I'm just not going to get vaccinated. And we're going to see outbreaks against, that we didn't need to see. We're going to see unnecessary suffering and death, because the reality is it's us against these viruses and bacteria. It's not one versus another. We all use vaccines to protect us against the real enemy, which are these viruses and bacteria that are trying to find places to replicate.
Yeah. Jamie, what advice do you have for the new committee?
Follow the evidence. And so if they have new evidence that we have not seen that thimerosal is a concern, then show us that evidence, show the public, and tell us why they're concerned. But we haven't seen anything like that. So make sure that you're making recommendations based on good, solid scientific evidence.
Well, Charlotte Moser and Jamie Lair, Dr. Jamie Lair, I want to thank you so much for joining Why Should I Trust You? And it's never easy being fired. I just want you guys to know that your voice matters, and we hope that you figure out a way to get out there and keep speaking to the public. There are all kinds of ways to do that, as we know these days. Thank you for joining Why Should I Trust You?
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
All right. And coming up next, we're going to be joined by Dr. Michael Mina, who has also spoken about these changes at ACIP and has a lot of thoughts about the new team that's now in place. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back. We are thrilled to welcome to Why Should I Trust You, Michael Mina. Dr. Michael Mina, he is an epidemiologist, an immunologist, and a physician. Over the course of his career, he's been an associate professor at the Harvard Medical School, as well as the Chan School of Public Health. And at the height of the pandemic, he led America's Test to Treat program, which connected home testing to treatment options. He's been a scientific advisor for health startups and has served on several high-profile boards. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Well, thank you so much. Very happy to be here.
So, Michael, let's just start off. You wrote in a recent New York Times op-ed that there's a confluence of things that make this a code red moment for vaccine policy in America. There are a bunch of developments that have you concerned to, varying degrees. But let's start with Secretary Kennedy firing and replacing the ACIP community. What do you make of this?
Yeah, so back in November, I was asked by the New York Times, could RFK Jr. actually single-handedly change the vaccine schedule or remove people's access to vaccines? And so with this New York Times report, this is before the inauguration and whatnot, this question came up and we bantered back and forth a bit. And I said, but on the one hand, no, RFK Jr. in his position could not single-handedly remove vaccines, unlicense them or revoke their licenses or change vaccine schedules and policies, there's a tremendous number of checks and balances that sort of help to mitigate that. But by the end of the conversation, I found myself saying, but the one thing he could do, has a much more insidious set of consequences, which is to effectively single-handedly alter the vaccine schedule, change recommendations by completely, replacing the ACIP members. And fast forward, to today, and that's exactly what he's done. The problem with this is not so much, there's been a lot of confusion about what it means to like revoke the ACIP members, put new ones in. This is distinct from FDA and vaccine licensure. This is recommendations. But in many ways, changing and altering the CDC recommendations to fit his idea of what a vaccine schedule should look like, has much longer lasting and more insidious consequences on the population, because these committees, doctors have been raised to like look to the CDC. We have generations of physicians and healthcare professionals in the US and abroad who have been raised to look at these authoritative figureheads, or the CDC, agencies, and kind of consume the information that they're putting out. And, and that's kind of the North Star of health practitioners. Even if clinicians know that the ACIP might not be operating to the full sort of benefit of public health, it's very hard to change that behavior, to change the institutions we look to as clinicians, as physicians, as healthcare practitioners. So I am extremely worried about this particular sort of movement to undermine the credibility, not just of the CDC, but really undermine the credibility over a longer arc of vaccines in general.
Sometimes what we hear from folks who are skeptical in this moment and who may support, the disbanding of this committee, for them, they feel like, well, the status quo always wants to maintain the status quo, and they always want to sort of protect institutions, and they want to protect an establishment that may be broken. And what do you say to that, right? Because is it ACIP that feels like it needs to be kind of like protected and it can't change? Is that kind of what we're saying here?
I don't think so at all. I am very much in favor of change in our public health institutions in the United States. To say that everything's been peachy is just to completely ignore how the basic sentiment just prior to President Trump getting into office. If you had gone and asked the average public health professional in December of 2024, how's the CDC doing these days? Most people would say, it's not particularly effective at doing its job. How's the NIH doing these days? It's really inefficient. And you know what? The overheads on institutions are ridiculous. Taxpayer dollars are going to administrative, bloat. I absolutely am in favor of change. And I'm not just in favor of it. I think it absolutely needs to happen. I think the next era of public health is going to look very different than the last. And we're no longer in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. We're in 2025. We have to reevaluate how it is we do public health. But that said, I think the problem, you can't, or I should say, it's probably not the most appropriate thing to just completely remove the safeguards, the approaches we've taken for decades now without a very clear path forward. Now, obviously, RFK Jr. did have a clear path forward, which kind of makes it scarier. He had a clear path forward. He wasn't just eliminating ACIP. He already had his members picked out. And we'll, I'm sure, get to that because I don't feel as reactionary against them as others. But I definitely think things need to change. I think we should be open to changing ACIP. Heck, maybe ACIP doesn't even need to exist. But just eliminating all the members in one fell swoop isn't the way to make that change. When you have a big ship, which the United States and our public health agencies and the approach to keeping Americans healthy is a very large ship, you can't just start, shutting off the engines to turn it, thinking that you'll get a new engine in 5 minutes. That's not how it works. But what I don't want people to think is that this is about preserving ACIP and these members. This is about preserving public health. And I think that message gets lost. Like I've seen so often that when firings are happening, the average public doesn't care about the person working at the NIH or the grant that's lost. They care about losing the drug that would cure them of cancer in the future. So I think sometimes we miss the mark when we're saying why these disruptions are important to the average person. It's not about the individuals on ACIP. It's not about the individuals at CDC who are getting fired or the programs or the grants getting lost. It's what that all means to the taxpayer, why taxpayer dollars go into funding all of this.
Yeah.
And that message, that end point of health for our kids and for us and for our elderly, that often gets lost in the commotion.
There was definitely a freak out on this one. I mean, RFK does a lot of things. Follow him on X. You can, he's speaking to a lot of different audiences, sometimes to the Trump administration, sometimes to the members of MAHA out across the country. There was a freak out over ACIP being sacked, and there was a freak out again when the new sort of 8 new members were named. In the first Trump administration, there was a dig on the media basically saying, you guys just don't get Trump. You overreact. Like a lot of this is bluster. Stick to kind of what he does. You guys have never understood him. You've always overreacted to him. Do you think there's been an overreaction when it comes to the 8 new people who are going to be, running this committee, on this committee? Or do you think that reaction to what you've seen so far of these 8 is warranted?
The short answer is my initial gut feeling when the 8 were announced was actually, that could have been a lot worse. And this is a reasonable group of people.
Wow, Mina, that's like a little different than what we're hearing from a lot of folks out there. Go tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'll jump ahead a little bit and then I'll go back and tell you about it. But I thought about it, after my initial, that could have been so much worse got over. I then became quite a bit more critical of the choices and including the way I first kind of came out publicly about it. In general, the group of people who were replaced, the 8 folks who were put onto ACIP, at least 6 of them, or 5 or 6 of them are very, I think they're bright individuals with long records of treating patients or doing good public health work, doing good research. 2 of them, I would say, are outright anti-vaccine, not just anti-vaccine, they're actually the perpetrators and the creators of bad, false information. So I think it's very scary to have those 2 individuals on the committee. What I saw, though, was a real lack of nuance by many of my own colleagues, by the public health community at large. Almost it felt like it was more about reacting to Trump and RFK Jr. than actually critically evaluating these individuals. I'll give one example that I think is an important one. There's an MIT professor who was put onto it that who has been quite critical of COVID vaccines and has raised concerns around whether there's adverse events associated with COVID vaccines. But if you look at his track record of just doing good, rigorous science, over a long arc, he's clearly a thoughtful individual who has put out good research. I think COVID was absolutely a polarizing event for everyone. And so some people are reacting very sort of adversely to the increased use of mRNA vaccines, feel like there's not enough evidence for it. So this individual, who I think is generally in overall a very reasonable person, has been, vilified for his stance on the mRNA vaccines, and effectively, but in a way that it's a little bit more extreme than if he, I think he's being vilified now just purely because he was an ACIP pick. He's being lumped into this group of this idea that he's just purely anti-vaccine because he's been, he's demonstrated a willingness and an openness to question the COVID vaccines, but from a very scientific perspective. I think that's totally appropriate to have somebody like that on the committee. But what I've seen is, in general, every pick has been torn apart. I've seen a lot of the public health community kind of dig into individual actions one action out of the whole arc of somebody's career and say, look at that, that means they're unfit for this job. It's a lot like what we've done to Jay Bhattacharya and Marty Makary. And both of those two individuals were very well-respected people, with the exception of one aspect of what they wanted to see with the COVID-19 response, which also, despite maybe not, it definitely didn't take off and it probably wouldn't have been the best thing. They showed a willingness to critically evaluate what it was we were doing. But the public health establishment jumped on them, and essentially they've been demonized and vilified and blacklisted from public health to the point where now they are, Trump's picks to lead public health, which is what happens when we push good people to the fringes because they come up with, interesting, maybe out there ideas. But when did we stop celebrating new ideas in academia and in public health and start vilifying when people go against the grain? That's what really bothers me.
Yeah.
Before I go too far there, though, I want to be really clear. That's all my gut instinct. That it could have been so much worse. But the reality is these people aren't fit for ACIP. They're not vaccine experts. So that's the other piece of this. They're not the horrible human beings that the public health establishment is making them out to be. But what they aren't, as well, is they're not the right people to be guiding U.S. vaccine response. And that's where the critical discussion should sit. Are they qualified? Not are they anti-vaxxers because they didn't want everyone to get boosted? That rhetoric is just undermining a real evaluation. I think what we need to be asking is are they appropriate? They're reasonable. Don't dig at their personal lives. Don't dig at this and that. Two of them are absolutely not reasonable in my view. I think it's actually good to have those people on the committee too, so that the rest of the committee knows what half of, not half, but what a lot of Americans are being exposed to. Because that's part of public health, is really recognizing.
But that's not. We're bringing a new team that's finally unbiased. Right, that's what RFK is promising. Finally,
no, this is not an unbiased team. No, this is far from an unbiased.
And to your point about expertise, I think it was the journal Science that said we've gone back and looked at the papers that this new team has published, and they've published something like 70 to 80% less papers on vaccines and vaccine technology than the crew that just got sacked. So there's a bias. They don't have expertise in vaccines. That's code red alert, or you could see a way that even with these things, this is a crew that could bring something that matters here.
I think time will tell. I don't think the majority of the new group are biased against vaccines in general. I think that's the important part. We're taking their response around COVID vaccines and driving, all kinds of assumptions about how critically these very, largely reasonable people are going to evaluate new data. But where it becomes scary is that, do they have the expertise to evaluate that data? Do they have the expertise to understand the immunological durability of a vaccine? Not that I think that the previous ACIP had all of that, but collectively as a group, it was a pretty diverse group. This is diverse in they're a diverse group, all right, but not around the topic of vaccines. They're on the front. They're out on the edges. Each of them has had, not even all of them, but most of them have had some relevant kind of discussion point with regard to vaccines. But in general, I wouldn't put any of them. None of them would be on a panel at a vaccine meeting talking about the nuances of vaccine policy.
I think that's really interesting, Michael. And I just want to ask, you mentioned before it wasn't perfect. So what were some of the things that you saw in the previous ACIP group that you would hope for a new one that maybe you aren't seeing with this cohort?
I think the biggest piece that I have been a little bit frustrated with ACIP and CDC in the past has been effectively an unwillingness to read the room of America. To understand that there is vaccine hesitancy growing, that there are a lot of vaccines being administered to kids, and with generally pretty much no willingness to discuss it, to discuss anything more than this is the vaccine schedule, this is what's best, this is what you got to do. And then, beyond that, suggesting, I would say, maybe not explicitly, that the vaccine schedule is optimized. And that's the reason that we're pushing this particular vaccine schedule on all Americans. The reality is it's not optimized. It's fine. You know, it generally seems to be working fine. But as more and more vaccines have come on board, we've heard a lot of parents of young kids question it. Question saying, you know, is this the right order to get vaccines? Is it the right spacing? And the reality is, like, we don't really know. Like, we think it's a pretty good schedule, but are we going back and reevaluating the overall schedule as we've as we've doubled the number of vaccines? Like, not really. No, we haven't. Do we have a good reason to believe we need to? Also, not really. No. So that's okay. What I haven't seen is a real willingness to discuss, to open the discussion with America, to say, look, this is who we are. This is why we're making the decisions. And we're seeing a growing number of people who have concerns. Maybe we should start doing precision vaccine schedules. Maybe we should be doing, thinking through what the next 100 years of vaccines look like. We haven't seen any of that. And I did, from my perspective, I saw what almost felt like just a complete ignorance of what millions and millions of Americans are now thinking.
You're talking about with the old committee?
With the old ACIP, and setting the.
So you don't trust anybody. You don't trust the old. You don't trust the new.
No,
Who do you trust, Doc?
I trust the old. I feel like this is where my view that we really need change at the CDC. I think we need to open.
You got that.
It's it's a different level of change, but it's it is very much in vein with in line with the kind of conversations you all, I think, are having. Yeah. Which is like to hear Americans. And this isn't some fringe group anymore. This is millions and millions of parents, people in my own circle who are now coming to me saying, should I get my kids all the normal vaccines per the schedule? Heck, I didn't get my kid a Hep B vaccine at birth. I spaced out my kids' vaccines around their COVID vaccines and other things. Like, there's real immunological reason to do this. There's real reason, very good public health minded people could question, does my baby need a Hep B vaccine on the first day of birth? Like, no, not in an era of widespread screening. We can delay that, put it out 3 months. Doesn't mean don't vaccinate for Hep B, but does it need to be, like, I look at Hep B vaccine as just an example of where ACIP and CDC haven't read the room. I view the Hep B vaccine at birth as almost like the gateway to vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah. I think you're talking about this conflation of ideology and politics and medicine and now vaccines. And is it really ACIP's job to, as you call it, read the room, right? Are they supposed to be reading the room, or are they supposed to be reading the Excel sheets with the data, right? So we've now separated, that we've collapsed the guardrails in a way. And it sounds like wanting more of that nuance in the ACAP boardroom.
That's a great question. Like, are you saying, if you think that, are you saying that because we're at a real tipping point here? We've got to protect the system. So in order to protect the system, you got to loosen and read the room more than just read the spreadsheet. Like, is that what you're saying?
I'll give an example. Javier Becerra, I think it was like 60 Minutes or something back in last year or a number of months ago, he was the HHS secretary under Biden. Somebody asked him, the interviewer asked him the question, like, given what we're seeing now with mRNA vaccines, people pushing back because there were effectively across the country, there were vaccine mandates and people responded, are now kind of reacting to that. The question was posed, would you do anything different given what you know now about how people have responded to vaccines? Would you have done anything different with the vaccine mandates? His response was, well, no, because the data showed it would save lives, that the vaccine was the best thing to get us out of the pandemic. And so the data showed that the vaccines were best, so I wouldn't change anything. But my argument with that is, well, that's one level of data, and I'm an immunologist and a vaccine immunologist and epidemiologist. So that's the data that I often live in. So I get that. But what about the social sciences and the human behavioral data? Why is it so wrong for public health to put weight on how humans will respond? It is also a scientific discipline that has everything to do with public health. And I think what happened is over the last decades, really since the advent of vaccines, they've been so amazingly powerful and beneficial that there wasn't the human aspect. Like, people clamored for vaccines, so we didn't have to grapple with this. But as we get into this lull of the infections that vaccines prevent, we have to start thinking about the broader scientific discipline of public health, which if you go into any public health school, you don't just find an immunology and an epidemiology department. You find actually the majority of a public health school is social sciences and behavioral sciences. And when did we just completely, as vaccine epidemiologists and decision makers, completely decide that that science is not relevant here?
Boy, that is such an interesting point, Michael, because what I'm hearing you say effectively is like, it's great that we've got people who want to really delve into like microbial behavior, but what about human behavior and the human psychology? And I want to get back to, the current committee, and let's just name names here. I mean, you take someone like Robert Malone and Martin Kulldorff, and what strikes me about the two of them is that the public, their public, really know them. Like, talk about ACIP and not knowing, and they're kind of operating behind closed doors. Robert Malone is he's been on Joe Rogan. He has his own Substack. He has books. Like, the guy is a really famous guy. And Martin Kulldorff was the co-author of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was a kind of a big rallying cry document for many folks in the dissident community. And I wonder, look, and there's a lot to be said about having people like that head up a committee to advise on immunization practices, right? What is their experience to really talk about that? But all that to say that, like, what do you think about the fact that these are people who have actually a very alive relationship with the public? Is that a good thing, ultimately?
I think it could be a good thing. I think it opens up all sorts of pressures, though, to align. Like, once you have a following, you align with your following, unless you're really strong and able to, go against them when it's right and go for them. So I think it's okay. And I would love more transparency in our government decision making in general around our policies, across the board. But I do think that there's a risk, however, with having people who are really deeply wedded to maybe not even their own beliefs, but at least projecting the beliefs of their constituents, the people who follow them. And, that is that, in my view, drives dogmatic approaches to decision making, because you're ultimately leaning as heavily or much more, depending on what person you are, into how you think that your public following is going to view. I think what's happening is, if I were to predict anyway, this was an explosive media cycle around getting rid of all the members. Bam, that was like the biggest damage that's going to be done was there. Then he kind of like comes in with like kind of a softball landing. He puts 8 new members on. None of them are great, but actually 6 of them really are like, they shouldn't have raised alarm bells with everyone, except that they don't have the expertise, but he could have put much worse people on the committee. Malone was, I think, the most outspoken kind of what I would argue sort of vaccine critic, anti-vaccine, but he's not the worst out there. There's way worse in this country. And so I think what's going to happen is he kind of like threw a softball. People like me played into it and said, well, this could have been worse. Like these 6 of these people are actually like thoughtful people. And now what's not going to make the news cycles as we move forward is when he does it drip by drip. Soon we'll see Suzanne Humphreys on there. People like that getting onto this committee would be like, they're as dug in as RFK Jr. And I think if we fast forward time, we're going to see this like slow incorporation of much more ideological people on this committee. And I believe that the whole goal, it's not just to change the vaccine schedule. Like, it's almost like the public health professionals and the media love to play into like these small talking points, like, oh, insurance isn't going to cover it. It's not like that's important. But what's much, much, much more important, and what I think he's going for, is to completely devastate any trust in these public health tools. And that's so much harder. That takes decades to get back. And when you break down that type of trust, it's much, much worse than insurance reimbursements or vaccine schedules.
Michael, final question. We started this podcast wanting to reassure our listeners that we would sort of be able to tell them, like, look, there's a lot out there that you have questions about. Some of it may be really worrying you. What is something that you just want our listeners to know in this moment as they try to help make sense of this, as they try to, look at the fall immunization schedules? If somebody just gave birth and they're seeing this play out, they may be getting a little nervous about what it all means for them. What do you want them to know?
I think there's a couple things. One, again, the vaccine licensure is not getting removed. All of this discussion around recommendations is a discussion just about that, recommendations coming from our public health bodies. But these are not legally binding recommendations. There are some consequences to potential insurance, things like that. But insurance companies across the board aren't legally mandated to pay for anything. They make decisions because they are funding things. So what I want people to know is like these vaccines aren't going anywhere. For the most part, they're still there. You could talk to your physician about them. Even if the vaccine schedule completely disappeared, 100% disappeared from the face of the earth, in terms of what the CDC is currently saying, well, you can still pull up the web archive and get your vaccine schedule. That it's not like the knowledge is gone. And the vaccines are still going to be available. They're still there. The companies aren't pulling them off the market. That might be. I'm not going to say that RFK Jr. won't try to figure out how to do that too. But at the moment, I want people to know that there's a lot of discussion around all of this, and it sounds extremely scary. It sounds like the U.S. government is withholding their baby's ability to get a vaccine or a treatment or something. But that's not what's happening. This is all about recommendations. It's a little bit more. It's a little bit less concrete to the average individual right now because the physicians aren't immediately changing their practices. You can still go and have discussions. And if you want, you can say, well, what would you have recommended a year ago, for me to get my baby? If you're really concerned about, how current decisions are influencing your pediatrician, and you can work with your doctor. I think that's really important to recognize. This is not about full-on access or licensure. This is about recommendations.
Is it a barrier?
I think it becomes a barrier over time and that's where that's where I'm extremely concerned and where I think about the code red. It's not about today. I think this is where the media cycle has been so focused on these immediate things, but the reality is insurance companies are going to still cover vaccines. Do they legally need to? No, but are they going to say no? They're not legally needing to cover any specific thing for the most part. Most things are their formulary. But I think over time, it becomes a massive barrier. And this is where I think the insidious approach that this government takes, or RFK Jr. is smart enough to figure this out, it's undermining to the point where the next generation of doctors, if I'm a physician and I want to see what's recommended, I'm still going to if the CDC starts to say this is dangerous, even if it's not, let's just say the CDC starts pounding that into people's heads because they have a group of people leading the CDC who shouldn't be there, that it's hard to ignore that. It's hard to, even as a clinician and as a physician who's trained, it's hard to not allow that to start driving you to have questions. Well, maybe it's not okay. Maybe I should be more critical. Maybe, and you do that over years. And I think it becomes a barrier very much. I think it also allows, will just open up the door. Physicians won't push so hard for a patient who says, I'm not sure if I want to get my kid an MMR vaccine. Right now, there's a lot of if you will, clinical peer pressure to really toe the line, stay there and say, no, you really should, and this is why. I wish more clinicians understood why, but to really have those discussions. But, I think in general, there's that pressure. And if the CDC stops recommending it, I think it's going to open up this opportunity for sort of path of least resistance. Okay, yep. Let's talk about that next time you come in. It's not currently recommended, so that's okay. And it will become a barrier to vaccines. And it will also become much, much, much more difficult to stand behind vaccine mandates for childhood vaccines like MMR for schools. If the CDC is not recommending it, then it's on the states to buck the federal agencies that they have for so long followed. And there's whole cascades of guidance around that.
Right.
So that's why, I would almost rather, for this administration, every public health professional just lie down, let the administration do, I'm saying this facetiously, but in some ways, like the better approach would be like, let them have the easy path. And in 4 years, we'll come back and, at least our foundations will still be there. I'm worried that they're going to dismantle the foundations. And that's so much harder to come back from.
Wow, Michael Mina, you just threw it all out there, man.
I thought we were going to feel better on that last answer.
I know. I'm like,
worse.
Wait,
Can
I
I
may
say-
go
I
scream
do
into
wanna
a
say
pillow
one-
right now, Michael.
No.
Can I say one thing, though, that I think is really important? We're talking about ACIP here, and I think that's, this is I did write that this is a code red for vaccines because of what I just mentioned. I'm worried about the foundational trust. But I do want people to know on both sides. I think you get listeners from all over the place. Yeah. There is so much reactionary kind of response from the media and from public health practitioners that even when this administration does something good, it's being kind of vilified and said that it's bad. Marty Makary, I'll just give an example, who's now leading FDA. He's doing some really good work. Everything, they published a piece in New England Journal that got completely skewered. It was about COVID vaccines. It got completely skewered by public health professionals, the establishment, because they said, hey, in this new context of, this stage of the epidemic, pandemic of COVID-19, we think that for younger, healthier people, we should require new vaccine trials. Specifically they called out placebo-controlled vaccine trials. But it's not all wrong, so that was taken as an affront to COVID vaccines, saying, this is just step one of them trying to dismantle the whole thing. But my perspective is, actually, I read that whole New England Journal piece that they wrote, and the biggest takeaway that I had was, wow, this is very reasonable. I'm glad to have somebody saying it out loud, who's in a position to actually do something about it. But to skewer Marty Makary and Vinay Prasad for suggesting that in this context of widespread immunity, that we can't or shouldn't recommend new studies to really understand what is the value of a booster for young, healthy people. I mean, we've seen some studies actually show negative efficacy. I just want people to know that there are things that are happening that are good. And I don't necessarily think that the way that they're doing it is right. Always does it need to be a placebo-controlled trial? No, but it's being portrayed, at least to half of America, that particular issue, as though our FDA is being run by lunatics who want to steal our COVID vaccines from us. But, they actually gave some very scientifically founded, data-driven discussion to the point where it was approved by, and accepted into New England Journal, one of the most preeminent, journals of our time. So I want people to, I know it's hard, but to just understand that there is this undercurrent of reaction by the public health establishment. And, I hope that it will kind of come back into the middle and people start to say, and without naming names, I've talked to people on both ACIP and VRPAC, which was FDA's advisory, about this issue. And behind closed doors, they said, yeah, I agree. I actually think that New England Journal piece by Marty and Vinay was actually quite reasonable. And I would push them further to just think about better ways to do the trials instead of placebo-controlled. So there's a lot of sentiment, but most people are afraid to say it, but these are the ACIP members and the VRPAC members who, have said it to me behind closed doors.
I mean, I think what you're getting at, Michael, is we are living in extremely polarized times. And, we're in a moment now where, of course, things that are really important to people, if they feel like it's being taken away, of course, you should fight. And I think that's the moment we're in. But I also hear you. And that's the value of our show, really, is to make nuance front and center and shine a spotlight on the things that really are worthy of discussion, and to make sure that we're not painting everything with such a broad brush. I want to thank Dr. Michael Mina for joining us on Why Should I Trust You? Immunologist, epidemiologist, physician. Does anyone ever call you Eminem? Michael Mina?
Never.
Yeah, never heard that before.
Are you from 8 Mile? Anyway, Dr. Mina, thank you for joining us. We had Charlotte Moser and Jamie Lair from, I guess they were formerly of ACIP, who joined us. I am Brenda Adhikari. He's Tom Johnson. She is Maggie Bartlett. He is Dr. Mark. Please send us questions, comments at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. And we will see you right back here next week.